When I first announced that I was changing my channel to be focused around video games, I said that I wasn't just going to cover Pokemon or gaming challenges, but I also wanted to do a couple of discussion videos, talking about some of my favourite games that I've played over the years. So with it being October, what better way to start off these discussions than with a video on my personal favourite horror game of all time, The Suffering. If you haven't heard of this game before, that's fine, as it isn't generally as well known as other bigger horror game franchises. Developed by Surreal Software, the game released in 2004 for the PS2, original Xbox, and in recent years it has been given a very solid PC port, along with its sequel, The Ties That Bind, which was released 1 year later for the same platforms. When it comes to horror games, I do have to admit that my experience with them is limited compared to other gaming genres. Whenever I have played horror games, I've usually stuck to the more action-oriented ones like Resident Evil 4, World War Z, and the Zombies mode from the older Call of Duty games. Horror games weren't something I generally flocked towards when I was younger, but one day my mum got me this little gem, knowing that I loved to shoot things in games, figuring that it would be a worthwhile purchase. And oh boy, it was, as this was one of the games that I've played the most on the PS2, and perhaps in general. Now, there are several main categories that I want to touch on in this video, so we'll break this down into 4 key sections, those being the story and premise, the atmosphere, the characters and the creatures that you encounter, as well as the gameplay. Now with all of that out of the way, let's jump right in and start off with the game's premise. The story takes place in modern day and centers around our protagonist, who is most commonly known as Tor. This isn't his real name and it is never revealed to us, which already serves to add a layer of mystery to the character. Something that both this game and the sequel do a lot of, as the more that is revealed about this guy, the more questions we are left with. His nickname works astonishingly well too, as Talk means tension, and that couldn't be more fitting for this character, but we'll talk about that later. Talk has been sent to Abbott State Penitentiary on the fictional Carney Island, an inhospitable speck of land that sits off the coast of eastern Baltimore. Talk has been sentenced to death row for the murder of his ex-wife and 2 younger boys. But here's the kicker. He can't remember any of it, as he blacked out for the entire ordeal. Just after being thrown into his cell, a cataclysm strikes the island and hundreds of vicious monsters emerge out of nowhere, killing everyone and everything in sight. So as you might expect, the main goal is to escape the island and figure out just exactly what happened to Talk's family. But to do this, we're gonna need some help. This game has several characters that shape Talk's journey over the course of the story, and they all have an effect on the game's overall outcome. But first, let's discuss Talk himself. I love Talk as a character, but to many other people, he might come across as either bland or just a plain arsehole. The biggest reason I've found for others thinking of him this way is because he doesn't speak. Like, ever. It's not that he can't, because there are a couple of flashback scenes in the sequel that show us he can speak. He just chooses not to, which makes him incredibly stoic. I really like this though, as it adds another layer of mystery to the guy, since we never truly know what he's actually thinking. Other reasons why people might find him unlikable might be due to the fact that he barely reacts to all the horrible things going on around him. And if you're only familiar with the first game, then the reason why isn't so obvious. The reasons for it are more apparent in the sequel, but I'll save that for the appropriate time. For now, I'll say this. Talk is a mentally broken man. Very broken. And it is likely that his psychological issues are why he reacts the way he does. This is frequently shown throughout the story, when we see him experience horrific visions of both his past, some of which seemingly happen at random, even when nothing of concern is happening during the game. This broken mind also leads to one of the game's more noteworthy mechanics, but we'll save that for later. Something else that sets Talk apart from other protagonists in horror games is the fact that Talk is not a man to be messed with. Usually in games that are intended to be scary, the player character is generally portrayed as somewhat weak in comparison to the threats they have to face. Not Talk though. You can tell just by looking at him that he is not someone to be messed around with. The creators also said behind the scenes that Talk is someone who can take on an army of creatures and be ready for more. Speaking of those creatures, the monsters in this game are incredible. They all have designs that are both incredibly disturbing, yet fascinating and brilliantly creative. To understand the basis behind them, you first have to understand the background for the island and the prison on it. Carnate is an island with decades, if not hundreds of years, with deep-rooted evil secrets, conspiracies, and supernatural history. Abbott, the prison that Talk gets sent to, is a former POW camp from World War II, with its own troubled history. Over the course of both its and the island's many years, people were killed in several less than ceremonious fashions. As a result, each of the monsters represents a different method in which a person was killed, specifically different styles of execution. I won't spoil all of them, but here are a few examples. The Slayer is the first monster you meet. These are humanoids with blades replacing the lower halves of their limbs, while their head is suspended on a metal apparatus. These are intended to represent those who have been decapitated. The Marksman is littered with bullet holes and carries a battery of World War II rifles on its back, whilst also wearing a blindfold. It represents prisoners killed by firing squads. And the Mainliner crawls across surfaces while trying to jab the player with the needles embedded throughout its body. Naturally, this thing could only represent people killed via lethal injection, and the rest are equally horrific. All of these monstrosities have their own cutscenes when they first appear, showing us just what each one is all about, and serves as another slice of the atmosphere, which ultimately makes things more tense for us, and the characters involved. While most of the characters that Talk interacts with are simple throwaways that serve the purpose of filling out one of the game's gameplay functions, there are a few that reoccur that provide us with some interesting insights and perspectives. The first of which is Carmen, Talk's ex-wife. It's never explained how she appears to us. Most likely, this is just her spirit, but it is hard to tell because Talk also gets tormented with visions of his two sons, Corey and Malcolm. With the exception of Talk himself, Carmen and the kids are the only reoccurring characters to appear on screen, along with the mysterious Dr. Killjoy. Appearing to us through a film projection, this former insane psychiatrist and surgeon, who used to run an insane asylum on the island, becomes fascinated with Talk and the unique case of his broken mind. There is also Horace Gage, a former inmate who tries to relate to Talk through his own troubled history. And lastly, there is Hermes T. Haight, the late head executioner for Abbott, who became utterly sadistic and became so obsessed with his profession that he took his own life in the gas chamber. All of these characters impact the story in some way, and they each leave something of a lasting impression on both us and Talk, and they all perfectly fit the tone and the atmosphere of the scenes they are featured in. Speaking of atmosphere, this game is incredibly atmospheric. When you're outside the prison, the island feels desolate and empty, especially when accompanied by the lack of music and the only sound being those of your footsteps. The beginning of the game is where the beauty shines though. You can hear the commotion down distant corridors with alarms going off, the growls and hissing of monsters behind doors before you even see them, as well as the cries and screams of inmates and guards alike. To add to the atmosphere, Talk semi-frequently experiences hallucinations and flashbacks throughout the course of the game, some of which are really disturbing.
You never were my dad. Not really.
Every time one of these occurs, you can hear Talk's heartbeat increase in intensity, and his shoulders shrug much faster, indicating an increase in his breathing. Taking place at nighttime, this game is very dark, and the limited lighting only adds to that, making any indoor location especially creepy to navigate, especially since you don't know when enemies are going to pop up. In addition, some of the enemies can be heard before you even see them. The aforementioned Slayers can be heard approaching as their metallic blades clank on the concrete, and the massive thuds of the stomping Festers is also unnerving. Whilst in the prison, you can inspect the security monitors, which show off some rather unsettling imagery, one of which shows the spirit of Horace approaching you, but when you turn around, he isn't there. The graphics in this game are decent for the time, but they are noticeably dated, as characters lack any sort of facial animations and can only emote through body language. There's also a fair bit of gore in the game, as you can often find corpses of people that have been horrifically murdered. You can also add to this by shooting the heads off certain enemies, or by completely destroying their torsos with the shotgun, and that is incredibly satisfying. When enemies die in front of you, their blood splatters all over you and your guns, which adds another layer of brutality to the game. The Suffering feels very Silent Hill inspired, not just by its setting and monster design, but also its music. Composed by Eric Aho, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the music for each given area was composed to sound as if it was created only by objects that could be found within those locations. And thus, like Silent Hill, a lot of metallic and industrial sounds can be heard, and it's really creepy. As I said before, the music comes and goes as it pleases, which I really like, since it adds to the feeling of desolation and loneliness you can experience when exploring the island. Sound effects use similar instruments and equipment to music, especially the hallucination jump scares, which never failed to catch me off guard as a kid, even though I knew where most of them were. The guns all sound impactful and chunky, and you really get a feel for the strength of each of them. Speaking of that, let's transition to the gameplay side of things. The game runs on the Riot engine and is primarily designed as a third-person shooter. However, you do have the option to switch back and forth between the third and first-person perspective. The first-person mode does help out a bit with shooting, and adds to the creepy, horrific atmosphere by seeing all these monsters right up in your face. But I usually tend to stick with the third-person mode. In this mode, you have a sort of pseudo-Max Payne style of gameplay. Jumping left or right will execute a dodge roll, allowing you to avoid incoming attacks. You have a fixed health bar that you can replenish with Zombium bottles, or painkillers. There are a couple of boss battles in the game, with some light puzzle elements, but they are really easy to figure out, so as long as you have some degree of common sense, you shouldn't have any real major difficulty. You can also find journal entries from two different characters, one of which is an encyclopedia on all the monsters, and the other which documents the various locations, and their not so pleasant history on the island. Some of this is really interesting stuff, and I would highly recommend you guys check it out. For combat, you can equip both a primary gun and a thrown weapon of your choice. There aren't that many different weapons in the game, but the ones you get do suffice. Melee wise, you can acquire both a shiv and a fire axe. The shiv is weaker, but has a faster attack speed. There are only 3 different guns available, but they do all work effectively. The revolver is first and is the most common and plentiful in ammo. It does decent damage, but doesn't have the best fire rate. But once you find a second one, you can dual wield, and there's no reason to use the single one again, as you double your damage output, and you can just go absolutely ham with these things. Easily my favourite weapon in the game. You also get a Tommy gun with a high drum magazine. This is your high DPS and distance-based weapon of choice. The shotgun is really powerful at close range, but its damage does drop off pretty quickly over distance. Still, it does grant you those lovely torso dismemberments, and can even knock over smaller enemies, giving you some much needed breathing room. There's also a craftable flamethrower available if you can find all the opponents for it. I don't think you can replenish its ammo without cheats though, so do be careful. There are also a couple of mounted LMGs lying around for a few segments, for when you have to hold out against an onslaught of enemies. Throwables range from flares to help illuminate dark areas, flashbangs to blind enemies, dynamite, molotovs, and grenades. All of their strengths and weaknesses, so choose wisely. You also get a flashlight that has limited battery use, so you have to remember to keep an eye out for those wherever you can. Whenever you encounter a new character, you can hear voices in Torque's head, trying to influence how you interact with them.
Give him a chance.
This is because you have the choice of a good, neutral, or evil ending. Achieving a certain desired ending is pretty self-explanatory. For the good ending, help as many people as you can. For evil, kill as many as possible. And for the neutral ending, simply run past everybody and ignore them. I swear, it took me ages to find out how to get the last one when I was a kid. You can check your moral alignment by Torque's family photo that is kept in your inventory. Torque's appearance also seems to change slightly based on which alignment you're leaning towards. If you're good, he appears clean. If you're neutral, he appears relatively dirty. And if you go evil, his skin fades to a greyish colour and starts to decay. The dialogue in certain cutscenes will also change depending on which morality you are going for, so keep that in mind. Now, how can I talk about the gameplay without mentioning this game's best mechanic? Yep, you can transform into a hideous monster yourself and go absolutely nuts, clawing and impaling enemies as you please. Early on into the game, this mechanic is introduced and works by filling up a rage meter once you've killed a certain number of enemies. You have to make sure to transform back before the meter runs out though, as it will actually kill you if you don't. In this state, you also get a super attack that increases in power after killing a certain amount of enemies. It starts off as a simple ground pound, then you unleash a circle of blades around you. This is followed by a small explosion, then you lash out with chains. And finally, you unleash a massive explosion that spreads throughout the entire room. You gotta be careful though, as this damages all of the destructible objects in the environment. So don't do it next to anything explosive. This power isn't hard to improve. In fact, you can fully upgrade it before you even escape the prison. Now there is an interesting bit of lore on this power, where Dr. Killjoy informs us that Torque doesn't actually transform, as this simply happens in his mind, and over the course of both games, various characters would comment on this, as Torque remains human in their eyes too. However, this particular topic really does require its own video, so maybe that's something we can touch on in the future. Now I don't want you all to think that I'm trying to make this game out as some sort of groundbreaking masterpiece, because it isn't. It has very clear inspirations taken from other titles, and for the most part, borrows a lot of mechanics from other games. However, I do consider this game to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, with its rather unique monster design, bleak setting, and some rather interesting lore surrounding both the places you visit and the characters you encounter, especially Torque himself. This game did birth a sequel the following year, in which the lore and backstory on Torque were expanded upon, and it is there that we learn some more interesting details on the character, some of which were only briefly alluded to in the first game. However, that game really does deserve its own video, so maybe that's a topic for another day. Remember, I am not trying to convince you that this is the absolute best horror game out there, because it isn't. There are scarier horror games out there, and there are ones with better action out there too. This has just been me explaining why I love this game, and by extension, the series as a whole. If you guys do want to try this game out for yourselves, I would recommend playing either the PS2 or PC versions of this game. I wouldn't recommend playing the Xbox version like I did, because while it is backwards compatible with the 360, it does have some compatibility issues, which leads to a couple of visual glitches. But even so, this game can still be enjoyed on whatever platform you choose to play it on. Now I've said enough for now, but if you'd like me to do a video talking about the sequel at some point, or even some other of my favourite video games of all time, then please, do let me know, because I would love to do more. I do have a couple games in mind, and even doing a couple gaming challenges with them, alongside this game. Alright, that's all I have for now, so until next time, thank you all very much for watching, and have an awesome Halloween.